Hello, and welcome to Group 3's presentation on fracking and health concerns. So first off, what is fracking? Hydraulic fracturing, or fracking, stimulates the flow of natural gas or oil, increasing the volume that can be recovered. Fractures are created by pumping large quantities of fluid at high pressure down a wellbore and into the target rock formation. Hydraulic fracturing fluid commonly consists of water, proponent, and chemical additives that open and enlarge fractures within the rock formation. Once the injection process is complete, the internal pressure causes the fluid or flow back to return to the surface. This fluid and produced water may contain the injected chemicals plus naturally occurring materials such as brines, metals, radionucleotides, and hydrocarbons. The flowback and produced water is typically stored on site in tanks or pits before treatment and disposal and recycling. In many cases, it is injected underground for disposal. The process of fracking creates several areas of health concerns for those living near and working on hydraulic fracturing sites. So, federal fracking regulations. Oil and gas companies are mainly regulated at the state level, but there are federal laws companies must abide by. Those are as follows: the Clean Air Act, which focuses on limiting air pollution; the Clean Water Act, which focuses on limiting pollutants into waterways; the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, which regulates disposal of hazardous wastes; the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act, which regulates the cleanup process after hazardous spills. However, after the passing of the Safe Drinking Water Act of 1974, the EPA decided that the oil and gas industry did not have to abide by all the guidelines because they claimed fracking did not inject fluid waste into well water and therefore did not harm drinking water. After the Safe Drinking Water Act drama, the Bush administration passed the Energy Policy Act of 2005, and this policy meant that energy policies in place through the federal government had little authority over fracking operations, and that regulation is mainly in the state's hands. In 2011, President Obama announced the creation of the Secretary of Energy Advisory Board to facilitate the development of shale gas, ensure environmental protection, and meet public concerns. In 2015, after the Standing Rock protests over the Dakota Access Pipeline, the Obama administration passed legislation allowing federal oversight of hydraulic fracturing on federal and tribal lands. Focus was placed on three main areas. One, requiring companies to disclose chemicals used in the fracturing process, requiring that any liquid waste generated during the fracturing process must be stored in steel tanks rather than open pits, and setting standards for the construction of the wells. However, the regulation was never put into effect because a judge in the federal district court in Wyoming struck down the legislation, ruling that the Interior Department lacked the authority from Congress to issue the regulation, and also noted that fracking was already subject to other regulations under state and federal law. In 2016, the EPA study found that there was scientific evidence for that hydraulic fracturing activities can impact drinking water resources in the United States under some circumstances. Yet in 2017, the Trump administration took final steps in repealing the Obama-era regulations on fracking, as well as expedited approval for the construction of the Keystone Pipeline. Currently, the majority of fracking regulations is under the jurisdiction of the individual states. In Colorado, the Colorado Oil and Gas Conservation Commission regulates oil and gas production. So there are some exposures from fracking that can lead to health problems. First is fluids. Hydraulic fracturing fluids are usually composed of 98 to 99.5 water and proponents like sand or resin. That leaves 0.5 to 2% of the total volume as chemical additives. While some companies do not disclose a full list of the chemical additives they use due to trade secrets, common chemical additives include formaldehyde, naphthalene, and acrylamide, which are known carcinogens. The concern is the return of the injected fluids to the surface in the form of flowback or produced waters will contain these chemical additives. The chemical additives can be toxic on their own, or they could contribute to the formation of toxic byproducts. The composition of both the flowback and produced waters vary due to the differences in the amount and type of chemical additives used in the hydraulic fracturing fluids. Researchers Chen and Carter found that most of the chemicals appearing in the hydraulic fracturing fluids can be removed when adopting appropriate treatments. the key word there being appropriate treatments, which involves the proper storage and processing of flowback and produced waters. It is when these fluids spill or leak that there's a health concern. The table on the right shows findings from the EPA's investigation of spills from January 2006 to April 2012, with 457 confirmed spills in that 6-year period. While Colorado, right there at the top of the list, does appear to have an alarmingly high number of spills, the EPA noted that the Colorado Oil and Gas Information System records were the most detailed and provided the most data. So that might be a little good news there in that hopefully Colorado is doing a more comprehensive job monitoring oil and gas production in the state and addressing spills. Another direct exposure that can happen is inhalation. The EPA reports that there have been well-documented air quality impacts in areas with active natural gas development, with increases in emissions of methane, volatile organic compounds, and hazardous air pollutants. Air pollution is of particular concern to workers at hydraulic fracturing well sites, as the chemical emissions from storage tanks and open flowback pits combine with the air concentrations from surrounding wells. While oil and gas workers are required by OSHA to wear protective respirators, no such protection is considered for the surrounding communities. A study from the Colorado School of Public Health in 2011 found that residents living less than half a mile from wells are at greater risk for health effects from natural gas development than are residents living more than half a mile from wells. The study also calculated higher cancer risks and non-cancer hazard indexes for residents living within that half a mile radius. The image on the left was taken in the town of Fredericks in Weld County, Colorado, where you can clearly see the drill rig right in front of the homes in that community. Chemical exposure represents another health risk. So 73% of chemicals used in fracking operations have adverse health effects. One study found that each of these chemicals has 6 to 14 adverse health effects, including skin, eye, and sensory organ damage, respiratory distress, including asthma, gastrointestinal and liver diseases, brain and nervous system damage, various cancers, and negative reproductive effects. In addition, an expansive study from the Yale School of Public Health found that 44% of water pollutants from fracking operations are known or possible carcinogens. However, many other chemicals identified lack sufficient data, highlighting the important knowledge gap in this area. Further research is needed to evaluate the carcinogenic potential of these chemicals. Benzene, a known carcinogen that affects the central nervous system in the short term and can also affect bone marrow, blood production, the immune system, and urogenital system with long-term exposure, has been found in concentrations high enough to affect human health in produced water spills. Air emissions are another source for health effects. Health effects from inhalation exposure to chemicals and particulate matter produced by fracking operations include respiratory illnesses and negative fetal outcomes. Chronic respiratory illnesses, including asthma and COPD, are induced by airborne particulate matter and exposure to exhaust from equipment used in on around fracking sites, such as compressors, pumps, and for transportation. Gases dissolved in flowback water also pose air emission risks. Children and young adults who spend time outdoors and the elderly are particularly vulnerable. Occupational exposure to airborne silica at fracking sites has been shown to cause silicosis, which is associated with systemic autoimmune processes. Non-methane hydrocarbons, methylene chloride, a toxic solvent, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons have been measured near newly fractured wells. These pollutants have been shown to negatively affect fetal outcomes. So there are challenges to solving these health issues. Increased regulation and monitoring of fracking operations can address some of the health risks, but there are challenges to pushing back against the oil and gas industry in Colorado, who in 2012 generated just over $410 million in tax revenue. This proves a strong incentive for state support of the industry. Colorado has a very strong oil and gas industry, supporting close to 250,000 jobs in 2015, providing a boost to the economy. But it also creates a large number of people with an occupational risk for exposure-related health hazards. Like other environmental justice issues, people cannot simply leave their homes because of pollution or proximity to a well site. Since proving the negative health outcomes of pollution is difficult, costly and needs long-term studies to fully understand, progress is not guaranteed. In 2012, voters in the city of Longmont passed a ban on fracking. In 2013, residents of Fort Collins passed a 5-year moratorium on fracking. The Colorado Oil and Gas Association challenged both of those bans, and in 2016, the Colorado Supreme Court struck down the local limits on fracking, supporting the state's supremacy in regulating the issue. What are some of the possible health solutions to the problem of fracking affecting community health? Education, informing the public that they are near fracking sites and what we know about the exposure is paramount. Working with industry to develop solutions that are not outright bans, trying to find that balance. There are already laws concerning proximity of oil or gas extraction sites to schools or residential areas, but that does not mean that it's rigorously enforced, and extending those limits has already faced opposition. Independent long-term studies that examine all possible health outcomes of communities affected by fracking operations are still needed. Scientific limitations of fracking are numerous. However, most of these limitations on research are due to federal regulations, which prohibit access for the development and monitoring of chemicals used. With many fracking sites located on private lands, access is blocked for researchers to get close measurements. In addition, the few scientific studies that have been carried out may end in non-disclosure agreements, restricting access for further research on the data. As mentioned before, one of the many difficulties is in developing standard protocols for monitoring practices. This issue arises from the variability among fracking sites, whether it be in terms of ecosystems, operation size, pad density, or quality control measures. Additionally, as more fracking sites develop, the chance for interaction between sites increases, greatly compounding the effects and making monitoring of one site difficult to control for. These cumulative effects can be difficult to measure, as many of the effects can develop slowly. This slide shows how proximity of sites can compound the interaction. So that's a map of all the current drill sites in Colorado. The image from drillmaps.com shows the active sites for drilling, including their proximity to other possible sources of pollution, such as refineries and power plants. Another major scientific limitation is in assessing the chemicals used in fracking fluids. Different state and federal laws and regulations prevent scientists and the public from knowing many of the chemicals present in the fracking fluid. Additionally, due to the vast numbers of chemicals used in the fluid, some estimates are reaching numbers over 500 chemicals. So developing a baseline data for these operations presents a challenge in and of itself. Lastly, there's a lack of research in the interaction of the chemicals used in hydraulic fracking fluid, and little is known on the fate of the individual components. And a massive report from Houseman and Ford, they are quoted as saying, "Data collection has not kept pace with the boom in extraction. A great deal of uncertainty remains regarding pollution from fracking." In summary, there are direct health concerns related to exposure from fracking fluids and air emissions, but more research is needed to understand the long-term health effects of fracking. Continued regulation and monitoring of oil and gas production is needed to ensure the health of those living and working near production sites. Thank you for your time, and there's our reference pages, and signing out. Thank you.